Are we starting? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this event organized by Al Qasat for Human Rights, the MENA Rights Group, and co sponsored by the Freedom Initiative and POMED. My name is Sarah Lee Whitson. I am the executive director of DAWN, Democracy for the Arab World Now, and a member of the board of Al Qasat. I am so delighted to be joining you here today to hear about the important findings of this new report by MENA Rights Group and Al Qasat about the Saudi Human Rights Commission. When we think of a Human Rights Commission, we think of an organization dedicated to defending the human rights of people inside a country from governmental abuses. But what this report by Al Qasat and MENA Rights Group shows is that, in fact, the Saudi Human Rights Commission is really about doing the opposite, and that is about defending the Saudi government from complaints of human rights abuses and doing its best to hide and cover and whitewash abuses of the Saudi of the Saudi government. I think the speakers are going to talk to us about the myriad ways in which the Saudi Human Rights Commission is a compromised entity. It is not independent, it is not unbiased, and the rules and regulations governing its operations, the makeup of its staff, and the actual work that is conducted should raise serious questions about whether or not the Saudi Human Rights Commission can and should be treated as a real and serious organization that acts as an interlocutor with other human rights bodies around the world. I think the information and evidence you will hear today from the various panelists will provide a very persuasive argument as to why it's not an independent or even quasi-independent human rights body. It is not working to uphold the rights of the Saudi people, nor is it an entity that should be treated as a credible, independent human rights organization. I want to introduce some of the speakers that we have here today. And I'm going to turn off that interrupting phone call, excuse me, to let me see the order of these speakers so that I can, are they presented in order? Well, maybe not in order, but hopefully in order. We have Lina Hathloul joining us. She is head of monitoring and advocacy at Al Qasat for Human Rights. And has not just an academic interest in this subject, but sadly a very personal one. Her sister, Lujain al-Hathloul, was not only unjustly imprisoned in Saudi Arabia on fanciful, fantastic charges for her human rights advocacy and remains travel banned in the country, but has witnessed firsthand the role of the Saudi Human Rights Commission in covering up Lina's torture and abuse. We also have with us Dua Dhaini, who's a senior researcher for the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights. Tanya Bulakovsky, a legal researcher with MENA Rights Group. My friend and former colleague, Abdallah Al-Ode, who is the Saudi director at the Freedom Initiative, and sadly also knows all too well the role and the experience of the Saudi Human Rights Commission in covering up the torture and abuse of his father, Salman Abu al-Ode, who remains in prison and facing the death penalty in Saudi Arabia, and has dozens of his family members arbitrarily travel banned in the country. I want to kick off this discussion and ask Tanya to first set the scene for us, asking her to give us some background information about the Saudi Human Rights Commission, who they are, what their mandate is, and what is our benchmark for judging the conduct of the Human Rights Commission? What are the international standards by which we judge the performance and activities of a government-appointed, government-funded human rights body? Tanya, can I turn it over to you?
Thank you so much. Um, yeah, so to set the scene a little bit, so the Saudi Human Rights Commission that we're talking about today was established in 2005. Its stated objective is to protect and promote human rights in Saudi Arabia while adhering to international human rights standards. The Commission's mandate can be found in the Statute of the Human Rights Commission, which serves as its legal basis. It serves as the foundational document that outlines its mission, its responsibilities, and its powers. And this statute was established through a resolution adopted by the Council of Ministers, which is led by the King, and whose chairman is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is also the Prime Minister. So the Commission is mandated to undertake a number of human rights related tasks, including raising public awareness on human rights, addressing human rights complaints, engaging in legislative work, and monitoring detention facilities. However, our report finds that the way in which the Saudi Human Rights Commission exercises its mandate is highly problematic. And the panelists of this webinar today will provide you with more insights into the Commission's practices. So now on the question of the international legal standards that the Saudi Human Rights Commission is bound by, this question speaks to the very purpose of our report and our webinar today, because according to its statute, the Commission stands as an independent entity, which is capable of holding the government accountable and advancing human rights on the ground. This criteria of independence and impartiality echo the international standards that are set out in the Paris Principles. And these Paris Principles are endorsed by the UN General Assembly, and they set out the minimum standards that national human rights institutions, or NHRIs, must meet, notably in order to be considered credible and to operate effectively. And as a general rule, NHRIs seek accreditation from the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, and it's in the process of this accreditation that NHRIs are assessed according to international standards set out in the Paris Principles. However, the particularity of the Saudi Human Rights Commission is that it has simply never sought such an accreditation. So therefore, it has never been assessed at the international level, and it is able to conduct its operations without any oversight. So essentially, through our report and with this webinar today, we aim to fill this gap and to provide a comprehensive and critical analysis and assessment of the Saudi Human Rights Commission in light of these international standards. So I pass it on to you.
All right. Thank you for that. Lena, tell us a little bit about how the Saudi Human Rights Commission describes the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. How does it describe women's rights in Saudi Arabia and the government's respect for those rights? How does this stack up to the way that human rights organizations, including Al-Qasat and MENA Rights Group, report and investigate and document the situation of human rights in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Another question after that. I'm not going to pile them all on you at once.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Well, I mean, before my sister was imprisoned, or while she was imprisoned, we were seeing a lot of, the Human Rights Commission basically applauding what the government considered as reforms when it comes to women's rights and so on, and it always failed to really acknowledge any kind of violation in Saudi Arabia. And while civil societies and our human rights organizations have worked and researched the actual male guardianship system in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Human Rights Commission only publicly applauds and thanks the government for what it does on human rights, and never really criticizes anything. And it even goes further than this. And this is where I'm firsthand I can testify this. When my sister Lujain was imprisoned because of her women's rights activism, She was forcibly disappeared for weeks, and she was tortured. During her imprisonment, no one was really allowed to visit my sister, and with public pressure and with her case really gaining international attention, the Saudi Human Rights Commission felt I think obliged to visit my sister Lujain, and they did. My sister told them about the torture. They saw it on her body. And at the end of the conversation, Lujain, my sister, asked them, "Can you promise me you can protect me after everything I told you?" Especially that, she mentioned some high-ranking officials that were involved in the torture, including Saud al-Qahtani. And they literally said that they can't promise they can protect her. So they just left my sister without any protection. And it goes even further than this, because after this visit, part of the delegation of the Human Rights Commission were women, including Amal al-Muallimi. And Amal al-Muallimi then later on traveled the world, just praising so-called reforms, saying that Saudi Arabia is reforming, that it is working on protecting women's rights, and failed to mention torture of Saudi women's rights activists, and denied it in some meetings. So, and then the Amal al-Muallimi, who was part of the delegation, was later on also promoted as ambassador. So we see that really they work to cover up the abuses, and to basically just rebrand Saudi Arabia as a country trying to reform. Another case is, for example, Salma al-Shihab, who was sentenced to 27 years in prison, first 34 years and then 27 years. Salma, just like everyone else, she is not allowed to be visited by independent monitors. But then with international attention, the new president of the Human Rights Commission visited her. And Salma, complained about her imprisonment, and asking for legitimate reasons why she's imprisoned. And Hala, the new the new president of the commission, failed to really justify, saying that there are new laws that are the basis on which Salma has been arrested, but then she failed to really give more information on these new laws. And basically, what the conversation between Salma and the Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Commission only had like ticking boxes of questions, are you comfortable? Is the food good? And so on. And Salma just wanted more than that. She told the Human Rights Commission that she has children who have autism, and that she wants to be able to see them, because she hasn't seen them in over 2 years since her imprisonment, because they can't see her in this situation. So she should be able to see them in a safe environment where they wouldn't be triggered by the prison. This was one of the requests. The second request was for her to be able to finish her PhD. And the third one is to be basically just released. And of course, none of these demands or inquiries have been met, or just dealt with the Human Rights Commission, and they just used this visit to justify their very existence at the UN level, saying that they actually visit prisoners and so on. Another, I think, just coming back to my sister as well, and Abdullah can also talk more about this, is that they always, they've been ignoring Lujain's inquiries when she was in prison from the start. She has complained about the torture. They have ignored her. She complained about the lack of medical visits. They ignored her. I think there are dozens of requests and complaints that have just been ignored. And after prison, my sister was on a travel ban. But not only my sister is on a travel ban, my whole family is on a travel ban. And this is the case of Abdullah as well. And my family has been inquiring about this illegal travel ban, meaning that it's just imposed by the state security illegally, without even being able to challenge it. So naturally, in a normal country, you would go to the Human Rights Commission to complain about it, and thinking that you might get help from them. But actually, no, they've been ignoring us, and they just fail to help us in this case. And my family has been still, has been deprived from traveling and forbidden from traveling since 2018. And the Human Rights Commission can't do anything about it, and they will, deny such abuses with their counterparts in the EU or in the UN. So I'll leave it here, and then maybe we can take it on later.
Well, just before we leave it there, obviously they did visit or purport to visit your sister. How many prison visits does the SHRC do? What kind of authority does it have to monitor places of detention broadly? Do they produce annual reports on visits to prison?
Yes, I think maybe Tanya, if you want to take it from.
Yes, so they claim that they visit prisons, and I think that they do, but their visits, I think, are used as a tool by the government before UN bodies to say, they did visit. So this is proof that there is oversight in our detention facilities, and this is proof that there is no torture and that these allegations are incorrect. So I think that their effective ability to do everything is null, as they're not a governmental body. They don't have any decision-making power, and they can effectively do nothing. But they're used basically as a tool by the government to prove that they do have oversight, they do have monitoring to, counter allegations of torture and ill treatment of their detainees.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, please, because I was also going to ask, do they visit all the prisons in the country annually? Is that kind of their program?
No, actually, no, they don't visit the prisons regularly. What we've noticed is they only visit cases when it gets when it's just embarrassing for them not to visit them, because there is international pressure, because there's international attention on cases. But I will also add on what Tanya said. It's actually funny, but so the Saudi government is very happy of the existence of this Saudi Human Rights Commission, because it can just compartmentalize human rights and say that there is a Human Rights Commission doing all the work, and then just using it in the responses in the UN. And they get it wrong sometimes. So, for example, in the case of Abdurrahman al-Sadhan, who is forcibly disappeared, they mentioned, the Saudi government mentions in its response to a complaint in the UN that the Saudi Human Rights Commission has visited Abdurrahman al-Sadhan in a prison, and they got it wrong. It's not even the prison where Abdurrahman al-Sadhan is. That is one thing. The second thing is also in the response to a complaint on the case of Salma al-Shihab, they got the date wrong of the visit. So basically, they just managed to say that the Human Rights Commission is doing its work, and that, they don't have any, they shouldn't be responsible of what is happening, because there is a body governing all this area. So yes, they're being obviously utilized as a covering up tool, and they do not visit prisons on a regular basis, because, and Abdullah can say it as well, his father has not been visited, and we have so many cases of people who are forcibly disappeared as well, or who have been in prison for years without any visits.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my document. Doa, the Human Rights Commission and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman have promised that they are going to halt the execution of juveniles. I mean, they announced these reforms to the death penalty with a great deal of fanfare. I think it's been over 2 years. Have these promises been met? What has the Human Rights Commission said about the continuing use of the death penalty in such high numbers in Saudi Arabia? We've seen death penalty figures that have skyrocketed since King Salman came to power, and the Crown Prince's powers have expanded.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Actually, death penalty is one of the most files that when you talk about human rights violation in Saudi Arabia, the number of executions stands out. And actually, as you can see, in the report we mentioned death penalty and how the Human Rights Commission really work in washing the image of the Saudi government in this file. So Saudi Arabia is in the top of the list of countries in terms of executions number. Since 2015, Saudi Arabia had executed more than 1,100 people, among them minors and demonstrators. 3 mass executions were prominent during this period, as well as arbitrary practices against those threatened with execution and those executed, such as torture, ill-treatment, and the denial of a fair trial. In exchange of these facts and figures, not opinions or analysis, comes the rule of the Human Rights Commission emerged to obscure the facts, actually. On the issue of the minors, for example, the Saudi Human Rights Commission was trying to cover up the facts before the Human Rights Council and in its statements, and denied that Saudi Arabia executed these minors even before issuing the juvenile law in 2018. Then, after issuing the juvenile law in 2018, the Saudi Human Rights Commission was saying that Saudi Arabia had permanently suspended death sentences against minors, and it did not address the issue of death penalty categories in its responses to contributions before Human Rights Council also. In April 2020, the Saudi Human Rights Commission published a royal order affirming the application of the juvenile law to all minors facing the death penalty. In August 2020, the Saudi Human Rights Commission published a statement on Twitter in which indicated that Saudi Arabia had completely banned the execution of children, of minors. And according to the statement, the Saudi juvenile law stipulates that the maximum penalty for any person convicted for a crime committed when he was a minor is 10 years. In February 2021, the former head of the Saudi Human Rights Commission, Awad Al-Awad, confirmed before also the Human Rights Council in Geneva that anyone who commits a death-worthy crime as a child will be sentenced to maximum sentence 10 years in prison. The Commission also repeated more than once that the penalty is limited to the most serious crimes. All these statements, respectively, are in fact the role of the Human Rights Commission. It did not investigate about the information of the execution of minors. It did not investigate about the fact of that the bodies of the executed individuals are not returned to the families, did not investigate in the information that are taken from the documents, from the court's documents, nothing, just repeating what the government talk and what the Crown Prince promises and the royal decrees without any analyzing of the facts and the information that had been published and monitored by the Human Rights Organization in the international level. Currently, according to our information, there are 9 young people, 9 minors who were tried on charges that occurred when they were at, less than 18 years old, are facing death penalty. The government denies this without verifying information about their ages, the nature of their charges, and the course of their trials, and so the Human Rights Commission. Information was received from the families that the Commission visit some of these minors, but unfortunately, this only resulted that the Supreme Court confirmed the ruling on 2 of them, unfortunately. Also, there is the issue, and death penalty is the minor issue, and also there are other issues that the Human Rights Commission tried to cover and wash the image of the Saudi government. For example, in the drugs executions and the executions in crimes that are not from the most serious crimes, the Saudi Human Rights Commission confirms before the Human Rights Council that Saudi Arabia stops the death penalty and just only for the most serious crimes, applying death penalty just for the most serious crimes. It ignores that death penalty is in charges of demonstrating, expressing opinions, and does not mention sentences on drug charges. Indeed, in January 2021, Saudi Human Rights Commission issued a statement and published it on Twitter, posted on Twitter, said that Saudi Arabia had suspended the implementation of murder of sentences death penalty sentences for drug crimes, with the aim of giving individuals facing non-violent charges a second chance. After almost 2 years, Saudi Arabia returned to execute on drug charges, and the Human Rights Commission never addressed this and never mentioned or justify how this is happening after their statement. So, according to what we see, and I think you can see in the report and with details, what the Saudi Human Rights Commission is doing is not is it just washing the image and of Saudi government and repeating the promises of the crown prince about reforms without any real role in trying to get people a fair trial, for example, to make these promises committed or happening. This is what the reality in dealing with death penalty in Saudi Arabia.
So just one question on the execution of minors. Is it that Saudi Arabia doesn't recognize that the ban on execution of minors means you can't put someone to death for crimes that they committed as children? Is that sort of the point
Yes,
where they're playing games on the terminology?
Yes, exactly. They are playing games in the age. They said that the detainee was not 18 when he was arrested, for example. And also, to be very clear, that even the juvenile law have some exceptions that also allow the minors to be executed in qisas and haraba. So what the Saudi Human Rights Commission, just to be also to see, the Human Rights Commission in front or before the Human Rights Council in Geneva ignore or even don't mention that even in the law, in juvenile law, minors can be executed in those two categories of punishment, and just in ta'zir sentences, which is the opinion of the judge, they stopped it by law, but actually in practice they are still applying it on minors, unfortunately.
Okay. Abdullah, can you tell the audience more about how the Human Rights Commission has dealt with individual cases of human rights violations? Obviously, one of the most famous cases is the Saudi government's murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And it's interesting to know what the Human Rights Council had to say on the trial that took place in Saudi Arabia, the acquittal of two of the masterminds. And I wonder whether there are other cases in which victims of abuses or their families contacted the Human Rights Commission asking for help. What has been the Human Rights Commission's response?
Thank you so much, Sarah Lee, and thank you, the sponsors and organizers of this event. Well, first of all, the philosophy and the existence of this Human Rights Commission is basically to, one, be the interlocutor between the Saudi government and other bodies around the world that wants to know more about human rights violations. The Saudi government felt a need for this, for the creation of this commission, because this will fill the gap about like the questions about like, well, we need an organization that is independent and within Saudi Arabia that works on the ground, that can document things, that can see things firsthand in order to get the information about human rights violations, not from the government. So what the Saudi government did is actually created this body that has been actually established by the Council of Ministers. The head of the body, the Human Rights Commission, is actually appointed by royal decree, and also the vice president or vice chairman of this body is also by a royal decree. This body, while it claims independence, it's actually clearly part of the government's agenda government's work to promote and praise government achievements instead of document violations or do any basic oversight. For the visits, for example, and I want to repeat what my colleague said, but for the visits, for example, just quick things. While they say part of the mandate is to be allowed to visit whomever they chooses to visit, they only visit when it's highly coordinated with the state security. They talk to the government first. They coordinate with them like any other government body. Like it operates like a clear government body while it claims otherwise. For the annual reports, for example, if you read them, and I've read a couple of them the past few years, and I've seen, you will notice a few things. One, they bury all the allegations about, like, for example, torture, violations, whatever, in only the numbers. They will give you, like, for example, a chart. It's like, oh, how many allegations they have received, this number. But they will never say any one of them, for example, is verified. They will never say there was torture, there was a violation. They only say we received this and this number. And to be honest, I like that at least they publish the numbers of how many allegations, not in all reports, but in some of the reports that I have seen. It's like they will say, for example, about the year in which Lajnah Hudlul complained about the torture and the electrocution and the sexual harassment. In the boxes, you will see how many numbers they were. We are not sure if Lajnah was considered by them as one of these, complaint that they received. But in the report itself, they will say there was no torture. The Saudi government applies this law that goes against torture, and in many, if not all of the cases that many of the organizations, including all of us here, when we correspond with the UN and submit files, many of the responses will always include the Human Rights Commission testifying that there was no torture, there was no violation. It all goes by the law, and the law is just basically criminalizes torture. It doesn't allow for violation and all of that. So it's basically used clearly by the Saudi government to correspond to the UN. And also it's used highly by the Saudi government, for example, when they receive Congress people or parliamentarians from Europe, the EU, from other parts of the world, when they ask questions about human rights, they will directly send them to this commission, and the commission will know its job to say, well, we have these reforms, we have these achievements, torture allegations were baseless, we have investigated, we are on the ground, we are part of the investigating a committee and this and that, in order to basically justify. So that's how they usually handle all of the allegations. And I will go to the case of Khashoggi that Salih asked me about. Like, for example, in the case of Khashoggi, when you go to their reports or public statements, there's nothing about the actual events and how it took place. All you see is, for example, the head of the commission. At that time, Bandar Al-Aiban, who was the head of the commission at that time in 2018, talking to the UN and UN bodies about the Khashoggi event, basically and literally quoting the Saudi government's responses to the Khashoggi murder. So, for example, they said all of the people who having engaged in the assassination against Khashoggi were actually prosecuted. They have brought to justice. They have faced trials. All of them were investigated. No torture, no allegations of torture has been brought in the investigations, and they also said the trial has been concluded, and the people involved are serving their sentences according to the Saudi courts. So that's basically their responses. They've never investigated. They've never done their independent investigation about the murder. All what they did historically is basically recycles the Saudi claims about the murder. They also, deny any involvement of any high official in the murder. And as we know, Saud al-Qahtani, Ahmed Asiri, and Mohammed bin Salman himself were part of ordering the operation. I don't want to take much of the time, but for example, the mass executions, and I want to echo what Dua said. Their constant dealing with the executions in Saudi Arabia is not just horrible. It's amazingly insane. They justify the executions in the past, and when there are a lot of pressure, they try to tone it down by saying, yes, the Saudi government is trying to reform. They are reforming. They just echoing the reforms, whether in against execution of minors or execution of adults. And in 2000, for example, 16, they basically just went bluntly justifying the mass executions, which was one of the biggest in Saudi Arabia. I want to end with their 2022 report, not their annual report, but actually a separate report that they used to just say that the government has been reforming a lot, and they have issued a lot of laws. I've never seen a human rights commission that just do a separate report solely to say that the Saudi government is doing well in every field possible. So it's just preposterous to treat this as a real human rights commission. It's basically a governmental tool to be an interlocutor with the UN, Congress, EU, parliamentarians, and governments around the world about human rights, to say basically what the Saudi government would say, but to seem like it's an independent body. That's what it does.
Sarah, can I add something?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Abdullah. That's very interesting. And actually, just regarding Jamal Khashoggi, Abdullah mentioned one thing, but there's also, I think, something that is very telling. So there is the statement of the former president of the Human Rights Commission, as Abdullah mentioned, but there's also the president at that time of the Human Rights Commission, days after the murder of Khashoggi. There was neither international investigations nor internal ones, nothing. No one had undertook anything. Only rumors were, saying that the Saudi government might be involved. And so instead, the president of the Human Rights Commission, instead of saying that we are waiting for, the outcome of independent investigations, he just tweeted, and literally that's his tweet, saying that, coming to the defense of the Saudi government directly, saying that, the Saudi government has never attacked any citizen, that it is not something that we do, just basically admitting that he is a mouthpiece of the government, and, not even trying to pretend that he is waiting for investigations to have an outcome. So I think, just following their Twitter page, now the new president, unfortunately, she doesn't have Twitter, but the former president of the Human Rights Commission's account is so telling of what they do and who they are, and how they deal with such violations.
Well, one last thing, if you allow me. Sorry. So I want to also remind you, it's good that Lena mentioned Awad al-Awad, the former president of or chairman of the commission. There was actually a scandal that I'm sure most of you followed when he actually threatened physical harm against the former rapporteur for extrajudicial killing, Anis Kalamar. And that was like scandalous. The Guardian actually published that, and just imagine the head of the Human Rights Commission at that time threatening to physically harm, and basically it's a hint of assassination. He said, people who stand in our way will know how to eliminate them, or something to that effect. He issued like a direct threat, a physical threat. So I'm not sure that this guy or this body will be able to investigate threats like these, or allegations of torture, or allegation of assassinations, if their own president is involved in such violations.
I remember back in the day when there was actually a little bit more space to talk in Saudi Arabia, when I met with Bandar and his staff and colleagues. They privately complained to me bitterly that the only thing he had done in the 2 years that he had at that point been in the position was spend all his time with renovation of the offices and buying new furniture and drapes. And that was his only accomplishment. I remember being pretty amused by that. But in the face of all this and what you guys are all pointing out to, I think the question is, should they be treated as interlocutors? Should the European Union's human rights bodies meet with them and treat them as a legitimate organization and sort of question them with the expectation that there's some shared camaraderie and shared values and principles? Or does that actually, make it worse? I mean, Tanya, can you tell us, what kind of international recognition has the Human Rights Commission received, and what institutions are engaging with it as sort of a legitimate human rights body? Or do they know? Is everyone just sort of playing along with this pretend game?
Yeah, so I mean, as highlighted by all the other panelists, the practices of the Saudi Human Rights Commission really demonstrate that their complete ineffectiveness and how they're simply used as a tool to cover up the state's human rights abuses. I mean, the portrayal of the state of human rights in the country by the Saudi Human Rights Commission, notably on women's rights advancement, is false and it's misleading. And to build upon what Abdullah and Lina explained about Khashoggi, I mean, even after his trial, the former president of the commission, Awad al-Awad, even saluted the trial's outcome in a tweet, portraying it as evidence of the impartiality of the judicial system. Their human rights complaint mechanism is completely ineffective, with complainants being met with nonsensical responses or lies, or just being ignored. Their legislative work, as Dora was saying as well, essentially consists of praising the adoption of laws or giving false or misleading statements on legislative changes without ever providing any critical analysis on laws that have been widely criticized for their impact on human rights. And in their visits to places of detention, they meet with detainees who directly raise to them their challenges, including brutal acts of torture and ill treatment, but the Commission has never taken any action. And in fact, these visits are instrumentalized by state authorities before UN human rights bodies as proof of the absence of torture and ill treatment against detainees. And in addition to these problematic practices I had mentioned before, it's a general rule that national human rights institutions should comply with the international standards that are set out in the Paris Principles in order to be considered credible and to gain international recognition. But however, despite the Saudi Human Rights Commission's blatant failure to be effective or to abide by the Paris Principles, the Saudi Human Rights Commission receives wide endorsement and international recognition, notably by a number of governments and international bodies. For instance, the Saudi Human Rights Commission has several ties with the United Nations and several of their agencies. For instance, the Commission has a memorandum of understanding with the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, focused on the issue of human trafficking since 2017, and the two entities renewed their partnership in 2021. The Commission has also had an active partnership with the OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, since 2012, through which they launched a technical cooperation program for human rights development in 2014. And I mean, in the context of this partnership, UN agencies, including the OHCHR and the UN Development Program, have advertised on their platform job opportunities dedicated to performing tasks for the Saudi Human Rights Commission. And the Saudi Human Rights Commission has also received wide recognition by the EU, by its member states, and by other government officials. In the past year, the president of the commission has notably met with government representatives from the Netherlands, from the UK, from the US, from Canada, and from the EU. And the commission will now be the counterpart, the official counterpart of the EU for the EU-Saudi Human Rights Dialogue, which I will let, I think, Lina say a little bit more about.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tanya. Sarah, just to answer your question and following Tanya's statement on and the EU-Saudi Human Rights Dialogue, look, our opinion, I think, changed over time. As you said, you know, there is no civic space in Saudi Arabia. We don't know really who to reach out to when there are violations. So at least I think me personally, I would say just a year ago, I was against boycotting, you know, the EU-Saudi Human Rights Dialogue, saying that, you know, at the very least, we have a door to open, you know, with the Saudi government, that they can maybe be the messenger of our you know, of what our demands and inquiries. And so, but then I saw since last year's EU-Saudi Human Rights Dialogue until this year, we've tried many times to engage with the Saudi Human Rights Commission, and they just ignore us. And we see all these, you know, photo ops on Twitter with, you know, members of the European Parliament, with, you know, just it's so glossy, and it's so, you know, it's so good looking, and it just gives a false impression of what Saudi Arabia is becoming. So I just, you know, maybe realized at some point that I don't see any effective measures. I don't see any positive change. I don't see them responding to us directly. And I just see it as, you know, being part of this, you know, a propaganda tool, basically, that Saudi Arabia is reforming. So, you know, I just wondered, maybe it's even worse than just, you know, covering up. They're also rebranding Saudi Arabia at the same time. So I just thought, yeah, at some point we have to be really radical in our demand with the EU and say that, look, if you're engaging with the Saudi Human Rights Commission publicly, and because actually before the EU-Saudi Human Rights Dialogue, the EU meets with us as civil society, but always privately. And then they also give us a feedback of the conversation, but also privately. So the question is, you know, why are you willing to give legitimacy to this commission when they're just, you know, part of the government, and not at least make your meeting with us public? So basically, at the end, when we saw that nothing is changing, I think that it's really time to disengage with the Saudi Human Rights Commission and have us, civil society, really documenting the abuses as a legitimate counterpart, or at least, you know, including us in this dialogue, instead of, you know, having the Saudi Human Rights Commission, you know, in a public meeting and doing all these great pictures, and having the real civil society engaged in a private room, you know, somewhere in the headquarters of the EU. So I would say, yes, now it's really time we have this report, everyone can go read it, it's clear who they are, so it's time to disengage, I think.
Well, I hear Lena's assessment. Abdullah, do you think that the Human Rights Commission is reformable? Do you think it could ever exercise any independence, at least to be like the Jordanian National Human Rights Commission, which does issue critical reports of the government, which are largely ignored? They still get into trouble, but they still do their job. Is it possible to imagine that the commission could act at all independently from the Saudi government? Or is it, is it actually beyond salvation, beyond reform, and are international human rights bodies like the EU Saudi dialogue doing harm by engaging with them?
Yeah, I think I'm more with the latter, but I think the problem, the essential problem with the Saudi Human Rights Commission is its structure, its hierarchy, its relationship to the government, and when you change that, it's not the Human Rights Commission that we know it anymore. So if we reform it, it would mean it would make it something else, and it will make the whole environment in Saudi Arabia susceptible to such change, and that's like a bigger project and a bigger change, and that's why I think just thinking and targeting to just reform this commission itself is worthless, and it's just a waste of time, to be honest. The bigger thing is like those who actually structured this and made it the way it is in order to make a change. So that's about the commission, and the problem with it is like it has been from the get-go. It's like it's not something like changed over time, or from the beginning. Like I remember even like during the like post the Arab Spring, the allegations, all of these things, they even when they try to engage or try to in the past, like pre Mohammed bin Salman period, it was only to make you silent about the allegations, or to make you satisfied without doing anything at all, to say that they received the complaint if there's any complaint. There was, for example, one, I remember like one report, perhaps in 2019, even like post Khashoggi, a report that was done by, it was a secret report. It was supposed to be a secret report by some people within the royal court, who actually talked about torture and named people. And this report was leaked to the Guardian and to other outlets around the world with names, including, for example, I remember like Adel Banam and some other people who was mentioned by name in the report as being tortured. And the thing is, like, there was even leaks that the people within the royal court talked about torture, but not the Human Rights Commission that was supposed to document things. That was like really part of its role is to investigate. Part of its role is to document. So yeah, I think it's, to be honest, worthless to reform such a commission, because if you want to reform it, you want to reform a bigger relationship with the Saudi government, with other entities, with the other institutions, and allowing bigger space for civil society. I think if we want to make a change, let's push for a change where real civil societies exist on the ground in Saudi Arabia.
I mean, well, that sort of pegs to the other question, which is, given that people go to prison for criticizing the government's human rights record, criticizing its failure to uphold women's rights and the rights of those sentenced to the death penalty, its own laws, how could the Human Rights Commission even theoretically or practically criticize the government without the commissioners and its staff themselves going to jail? I'm sorry, I'm going off script here, but
no, it's good. It's a very good
I'm thinking of the structural impediments. I mean, wouldn't the commissioners themselves face the death penalty if they said things, if they described the accurate truth of the country's human rights record?
Actually, sorry if I may, The thing is, the commissioner and all the members, also you can see in the report we have mentioned about the members, they are employee of the government after all. So if they will criticize, it will be, if they will criticize, it will be under what the government will allow them. And the main thing I would assume is to know, for example, for the European, for the UN, to be for them that it's very clear that this commission is a tool that Saudi government is using. Then the next step, what we will replace, how should we deal with this commission, would be something to discuss. But first of all, to be very clear for them that it's being used by the government as a tool to washing. As what's happening now is that Saudi government is establishing new tools of washing its image, and the Human Rights Commission is an old tool. So I don't think that they will be threatened, because actually they will not criticize in a way that they will face the Saudi government. They are employee of the Crown Prince and the King.
So I guess then, looking to your recommendations, and these are some challenging questions that you're putting forward, and I think you're presenting them with the weight of your experience and evidence behind you. But the argument from people in the EU-Saudi dialogue and so forth make is that, listen, this is all we have to deal with. All we have is the Human Rights Council. They're the only ones we can talk to regarding human rights in Saudi. It's better to talk to them a little bit so they at least know what we're expecting than not to talk to them at all. How do you respond to that? Obviously the Saudi Human Rights Commission is not the first, is not the last government-funded, government-controlled human rights body that they interact with. But what's the alternative? What's a better path for them to focus on reporting, documenting, and making recommendations about the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia? What would be their realistic ability to speak directly to civil society and activists in Saudi Arabia? I mean, that would obviously be very dangerous for the people on the ground. So what's a better framework?
Mm-hmm. Can I jump in here? Thank you, Sarah. Well, I think, regarding the first question, when they say that they don't have any other counterpart and that, they have to be speaking to someone, my question is, do they want to have impact, or are they doing it to tick boxes? If they know that the Human Rights Commission is not useful, with now our report, with this conversation, with civil society telling them, look, they are not useful, then they have to find an alternative. And the alternative is us. We are here, we document, we are abroad, we are safe, and we are connected to what is happening on the ground. And the second thing is, Saudi Arabia is not a country that is as isolated. Saudi Arabia wants, foreign investment. They want Western visitors and tourists. So the really issue is the very fact that human rights are compartmentalized, and that, we only want to deal with human rights with counterparts who only deal with human rights. No, I think that if the EU truly wants to tackle the issue of, human rights, they also have to mention human rights in other, areas, and and the diplomatic relations, including tourism. I think that, again, they always say, yeah, but Saudi Arabia doesn't want to hear us when it comes to human rights. I'm like, it's because you're not talking to the right people. If you talk about human rights to the Minister of Tourism, they will hear you, because they want you to come. They want, foreign tourists to come. So I think that the very issue is the problem is the essence of EU human rights dialogues, where only counterparts who are dealing with solely human rights issue talk, and then at the end it's the outcome of it is a statement, and it doesn't really bring any change. So for me, human rights have to be tackled with everyone in Saudi Arabia who has power, including people involved in tourism and oil.
I want to hear others commenting on this question. I think it's one that's open to everyone. But I wonder whether there'd be any way in which, for example, the EU Saudi human rights dialogue can be persuaded to include civil society in the meetings with the Saudi Council.
Yeah, if I can jump in. I mean, to talk about the EU-Saudi human rights dialogue, especially, I mean, as Lina said, there's the possibility of civil society, but there's also the possibility of, the state. I mean, there seems to be confusion about the very nature of the commission. I mean, when international bodies or the EU are talking to the Saudi Human Rights Commission, they have to ask themselves, like, who are we considering that we're talking to? Because on one hand, the Saudi Human Rights Commission claims to be the NHRI of Saudi Arabia. They claim to be an independent human rights entity capable of holding the government accountable. But then on the other hand, their lack of independence is blatant and it's completely undeniable. I mean, not only do their activities and public statements systematically align with the position of the government, but even their composition. I mean, as Abdullah said, all of the commission's members are appointed by the king. And I mean, even more concerning is that in certain instances, for example, in the EU human rights dialogue, they're presented and considered as the official representative of the government. Even before the UN, they've repeatedly acted as the state delegation, for example, in the context of the Universal Periodic Review, which is, of course, highly problematic in light of the Paris Principles. And now with the EU delegation, I mean, they're considering them as state representatives. So the first step, I think, is to establish that they are not a state representative. They're not a governmental body, and they should not be considered as such because they have no decision-making power, and so a human rights dialogue with them can not be effective by nature. So, in fact, they actively contribute to concealing and covering up states' human rights violations. So it's truly counterproductive. So, really think that a first step in all of these dialogues or in any international engagement is that the Commission is no longer considered as a viable counterpart, neither for the EU nor for governmental or international bodies, because effectively engaging with them only enhances their recognition and their legitimacy, and it allows them to perpetuate their whitewashing of human rights violations. So I think this is really a strong first step.
Great. If anybody else wants to comment on that question, please go ahead, because otherwise I think we're going to turn it to Q&A. Is there comments from the audience that we're meant to entertain? Great. I see many here. Should I just call on people or should I read their questions?
I think
guess-
you can go ahead, Sarah, and read.
Read them?
Yeah.
Sure. So Danya Akkad asks, if the commission was accredited with the GANHRI, what would happen, and what do you want to happen, and how unusual is it for a national human rights organization not to be accredited this way? Sorry, Tanya, this is for you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I can jump in. I mean, through our report, we really don't want to kind of say if they do get accreditation and if they do apply for accreditation, then everything will be perfect. But we think that as a first step, if they do apply for accreditation, then it will be the opportunity for them to be assessed, at least, for there to be, public record of different stakeholders, civil society to participate to their assessment. And that way, I mean, until before our report, it was very difficult to find, publicly accessible information or any critical analysis of their operations, of their activities, and of what they're doing. And we're seeing, increasing international recognition, including by the OHCHR. So we think that although we don't necessarily 100% abide by, the GANRI's accreditation, as, many NHRIs, which also lack independence and which are also problematic, have been granted, status A. A first step would be nice in order to be at least assessed and for there to be a public record and on their activities.
We've talked about the way in which the Human Rights Council is really there as a PR firm for Saudi Arabia, meant to handle criticism, manage reports and dialogues and whatnot. Does the NHRI itself rely on lobbyists to bolster its own image and standing? That's another question from the panel.
Yeah,
from
they
the
actually do.
audience.
Yeah, they actually do. It's funny that, for example, in multiple years, they have actually signed contracts with PR firm in the States and elsewhere elsewhere in Europe to actually promote their image and the Saudi image for that reason. For example, one of the contracts that I remember was with Gorvez.
Corvus?
Yeah, the same actually was the same actually PR firm that actually was signing contracts with at the time the royal court, other parts of the Saudi government. So they basically, and they, if I remember correctly, they have paid 8 million, I think. I don't remember, like just like at one time. So it's yes, they use PR firms like any other government body in order to, and they have been paid by the Saudi government, of course, to basically make them the head of and the responder basically to any questions about like human rights, about allegations, about violations and torture. And I think they have been doing a lot of efforts in that front.
Okay. I guess, is there, I mean, I'm looking at some of these questions and I think they've really actually been asked already. I guess my final question, since I don't see any more comments from the audience, is, what is the immediate and direct and specific thing you want the EU human rights committees to do with respect to their interactions with Saudi Arabia and the Human Rights Council? Let's just leave it with the final recommendation to them.
Maybe I can start, but I think there are two things. The first thing is to give a voice to real civil society again and publicly. It's very good to meet with us privately, but I think that we also have to be recognized as the legitimate and credible civil society organizations. That's the first thing. And not only for our own legitimacy, it's also for the Saudi government to understand that, they are being watched and that there are potential counterpowers. I think it's important. It's an important message to the Saudi government. The second thing is to, I think, I don't know how to say this, but to splash the bubble of opacity in Saudi Arabia. And for that, I think that the main recommendation would be, first, to open trials to everyone, not have trials behind closed doors, because it's very important. As I think for me personally, if trials are open to the public, then Saudi Arabia won't be able to lie as much as they do when it comes to the prosecution of human rights activists. And it's very good to have responses by the Saudi government saying that Lujain is a terrorist or Abdullah's father is a terrorist, or but then if people can go to court, that the EU human rights commissions can go to court and assess the responses of the detainees, then we open doors for more advocacy and for a push in human rights. But as long as trials are held behind closed doors, I think that it's just not possible to push for change at this stage.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you to our audience. Thank you for this important report. And I'm sure you will all have a chance to download the report and read it. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank